Dear Denisa, thank you very much for joining our series, Conversation with Experts, here hosted by the ECMI. And today I have a pleasure to talk to Dr. Denisa Kostovicova, who's the Associate Professor in Global Politics and also the Director of the London School of Economics and Political Sciences Center on Researching Southeastern Europe. Also, Denisa's accolades include being a speaker at our last summer school, and I can tell this was one of the most liked and most popular lectures. Despite being online, I think you did great conveying the message, and lots of people were very, very happy. So, and today we will talk about Denisa's latest book, Reconciliation by Stealth, which I remember came out last year.
That's correct, yeah.
Published by the Cornell University Press, and in this book, Denisa is taking stock on the Balkan conflicts through the lens of what happens when former adversaries try to talk to each other and sort of employ the future-looking perspective rather than focusing on past conflicts. And as far as I remember, also one of the angles of this book was the methodological shortcomings that tend to overlook the whole deliberation process.
That's right. Yeah.
Yes, so let's just kick off. And my first question would be a more general one. If you can tell me what actually inspired you to research reconciliation and relation between ethnic identity and deliberation when it comes to post-conflict settings.
Thank you, Aziz, first for your invitation to do this session. I'm really excited to talk about the book, and also for your kind introductory remarks. I've really enjoyed the summer school and interacting with your students. And this is kind of a second occasion when we have a chance to talk. So thank you for that too.
Thank you for being here.
So what inspired me to address this question of reconciliation and specifically to look at it from the perspective that I did? Well, I came to the question from different perspectives. I would say one would be sort of academic and theoretical, and the second was kind of a practitioner, real life perspective. So I'll start with actually the second one. And if you sort of look at the discourse, for example, what is talked about reconciliation in the Balkans so many years after the conflict has ended, everybody is saying that there is absolutely no reconciliation. The typical sort of trope that people use, and here we can talk about both practitioners and academics, is elusive reconciliation. So there is basically no reconciliation. And as a matter of fact, I've then sort of, when I was reading newspapers, then I looked and I found one statement by one formerly sort of convicted a war criminal in The Hague, who upon return also said there is no reconciliation and there cannot be reconciliation. And that really sort of made me think that actually, you know, it is very easy to sort of slip into this discourse that there is no reconciliation and there cannot ever be reconciliation. Sort of, it is very easy to sort of make this whole project of addressing the horrible things that happened, and sort of trying to seek justice, and sort of not achieve anything. And that kind of sort of a little bit rang alarm bells, especially coming from someone who was convicted of war crimes. And then, so this is kind of at a practical level. Do we really kind of completely delegitimize any possibility of reconciliation? And this kind of a little bit connects with sort of the academic perspective, and the literature that I've engaged with, and that is what is actually reconciliation. And we know that reconciliation is a notoriously difficult to define.
Mm-hmm.
It is very slippery as a concept, which therefore means it's very difficult to operationalize. And again, most of the scholarship ends up with the same thing. There is a elusive, reconciliation, and this is not just in the Balkans. If you look any other area, sort of past conflicts, sort of the narrative is the same, and therefore I was inspired to look a little bit more closely at it and see, is this really so?
Mm-hmm. I can understand, because that was a bold statement to completely brush off reconciliation, both as a maybe theoretical concept, but also its real life implication.
Indeed. And also, if you do research and if you talk to different communities, you will see that in certain circumstances, under certain conditions, people do come together, even in the worst, in the context of worst atrocities. And I was thinking that we really don't know how to conceptualize this, how to approach this. Do we dare call these instances reconciliation, right? Because sometimes people will and scholars will say, actually, unless there is some expression of remorse, right? Explicit acknowledgement of the wrongs, there cannot be reconciliation. And that again brings us back to the idea of what do we mean when we say reconciliation, and even more importantly, as scholars, how do we define it and how do we study it so that everything coheres from your definition to your operationalization to the empirical strategy that you apply, etc., etc.
I'm very happy you actually ended with this sentence, because that was my second question, is how you actually did define and operationalize the term, the concept reconciliation by stealth in your book.
Yes. So what I've done was, obviously, I've done a very thorough research into different ways that scholars have approached the concept of reconciliation, and I thought that I think the one kind of a very important starting point would be is that there is not a single meaning. Okay, so basically, I took a conceptualization of reconciliation, of which, as I said, there are many. But what I took from the literature was the importance of, as I just said a minute ago, aligning the definition and an empirical strategy. So because I'm interested in discourse and the importance of words, both before conflict, in the Balkans, it is often said, before a first, person was, killed by a bullet, they were killed by words, right? So the importance of words and what is said and how it's said.
Right.
I've been interested basically in public communication. Okay, so and I think kind of this idea of public here is quite important because often, especially in polarized post-conflict spaces, people may come across together across the lines of conflict, let's say ethnic lines, as in the Balkans, and speak, but that may happen in private spaces. I was interested in the public dimension, right? Because it also kind of raises the stakes. on the one hand, and on the other hand also is important because it demonstrates if, you know, former antagonists can communicate in a civil way. Sort of, it has a sort of it has a sort of innate power, if you like, to show to others that it can be done differently. So therefore, I approached, as I said, sort of broadly reconciliation. So I looked for a sort of way in sort of public communication, and then I was thinking, okay, so what is that communication? How should it look like for it to be reconciliatory? And from there, I brought in the scholarships and the theory on democratic deliberation into transitional justice to develop a model of reconciliatory communication, and that would focus on rational argumentation, right? Sort of a good quality of deliberation on the one hand, and on the other hand on discursive solidarity. So these would be two sort of conditions for communication among the former antagonists to be reconciliatory.
Just a quick follow-up is, I'm wondering what were the main challenges for you then when you're trying to use this operationalized framework? Because I remember you employed both qualitative and quantitative tools, and that's just curious. I'm curious to know what was the biggest challenges for you.
Yes, thank you. So what I did sort of when I sort of reached out, if you like, when I thought that sort of the theory of democratic deliberation could be really helpful sort of for the framing of reconciliation, I was drawn to the concept because I was reading a lot of literature on sort of benefits of deliberation. Okay, but that means that we need to conceptualize deliberation and sort of true to its meaning. What do I mean by this? When scholars talk about deliberation, they talk about a specific kind of communication, right? It's a communication which fulfills certain, and this is how it's referred to in the scholarship, deliberative standards or deliberative virtues, right? So for a communication or discussion to be called deliberative, it has to be the speakers need to provide arguments for what they say, right? They cannot just say, I want this or that without providing their arguments. But it's also important to take note how those arguments are made. You know, I could make, for example, in the context, in a post-conflict context, I could present an argument just because it's good for my ethnic group, right? Without taking common good. So it has to have common good. It has to be respectful, okay? It has to take account of the arguments of others, right? Of counter arguments and engage with them. And only when communication is such do we call it deliberation. And then there are a host of empirical studies, although not in the post-conflict societies and not in the societies that were not in the societies where you know people discuss conflict or very polarizing issues directly related to the harm that was done during conflict, which showed that if communication is deliberative, then it can have had positive effects. But the scholars of transitional justice have mentioned deliberation, right? And they've said, you know, this is a framework that could be good for transitional justice and maybe for peace. But what they've done is what we call concept stretching, you know. And there are a lot of books and articles where you see scholars mentioning deliberation, but none of them ever looked at, is the discussion about transitional justice, is it respectful? How are arguments framed? And all, so no one ever tracked empirically, how that communication unfolds. Is it actually deliberative? So if you like, so this was sort of a challenge for me, because I really wanted to show and really test whether you could address the most polarizing issues in post-conflict societies, such as war crimes, deliberatively, which would require you to also, as I said, track how these deliberative, whether they're present at all, and then, doing different kinds of empirical analysis, statistical analysis, find out what drives the quality of deliberation and what doesn't. And within sort of this challenge, so I also wanted to devise sort of a better measures, sort of better ways of capturing how identity matters, which is how, so this is what I've done. So I was kind of looking at how the sense of ethnicness, impacts the quality of deliberation, sort of going, building on arguments that, as scholars say, that if you want reconciliation, you should move from sort of ethnic, sort of, if you like, ascriptive identities and talk in terms of human rights, right? So, if I may say, this was kind of a challenge to undertake empirical work, right? That would be designed coherently to match up with the context, and of course to execute it, because just the coding took about just 8 months, just coding of my data set, nothing else.
This is
I was fortunate. Yes, I was fortunate to be successful, to get a grant. It was funded by Leverhulme Trust, where which relieved me of teaching, and I thought that I could do the whole project in within that year. But actually, what I ended up doing was just coding.
Yes.
So
I'm happy that it resulted in this book, which is also, by the way, open access for everybody to have a look. I want to go back to your statement about how most of the scholars actually overlooked the relation between the transitional justice and its impact on reconciliation. And how do you explain this? Why this has been happening continuously?
I think, I think that goes back to this confusion about definition and the difficulties in measuring the impacts. And here I don't mean that sort of the valid measurement is quantitative. On the contrary, my book is a mixed method book, so it leverages both qualitative and quantitative methods. And also, perhaps maybe just to go back to the very beginning of the book and maybe the start of our conversation, was what I've done in the book. I reversed the perspective, because most scholarship is in transitional justice is motivated by the puzzle that asks why transitional justice doesn't work. In other words, how do different transitional justice mechanisms disappoint those who are seeking justice, right? So these are sort of the discussion about unintended consequences of transitional justice, thinking that we think that if you have, for example, trials or truth commissions, this will result in victims being recognized, right? And maybe compensated for their suffering. And yet what happens, their denigrated, rejected, their suffering is demeaned, etc., etc. But I asked, actually, so we know a lot about how transitional justice doesn't work. But what if we flip the perspective? What if we try to look and recognize what has worked? And in this context, the sort of the empirical case that I was looking at, which was the RECOM process. This is the acronym for a longer name of this multi-ethnic civil society initiative in the Balkans that organized the discussions about war crimes and what should be done throughout former Yugoslavia, with the goal of creating a regional process where regional process, and they call it fact-finding process, where they would record the circumstances of harm for all the victims. So within this process, basically, because there has been resistance of the authorities of the states in countries emerging from former Yugoslavia, has never been established, right? As a civil society process, they advocated that this should be actually an interstate process after, substantive consultations and after the adoption of a draft statute to present it to their states. This has never happened. So the initiative has been sort of intrigued scholars, and they've looked at it, but everybody has just had one and only conclusion, that it's been a total failure, right?
Yes.
And yet I've looked at the transcripts of the consultations that they've held, of which they've done over 150 in different parts of former Yugoslavia, right? In villages, in town, in cities, at the local, national, and regional level. I also attended some of those, and I actually thought that something quite important happened in that process of conversations and discussions across ethnic lines that basically we haven't even looked at, because people have just focused on the outcome and the fact that this commission has never been established.
Thank you, Denisa. This sort of preempted my next question about RECOM, actually, and I remember you saying that it is quite a unique entity. And do you know of any other similar initiatives?
I am actually not aware of any similar initiatives, but what I think is very important is that the idea of transitional justice having to be regional to match with regional, i.e. cross-border dimensions of conflicts is, I think, becoming more prominent and recognized in the scholarship and a little bit in the practice. So I'm aware about some thinking happening along those lines in relation to some conflicts in Latin America and also in Africa. But and I do know that there have been some collaborations where people who have participated in RECOM have gone to share their experiences, but I'm not aware that the same process is being replicated as such. But this is, in terms of what I do in the book, I think this is another kind of important line of investigation, where I also criticized sort of the previous studies, if you like, of deliberation in post-conflict societies, which have always focused on conversation involving two parties to a conflict, right? which doesn't really align with the complexity and the reality of contemporary conflicts, right? Conflicts can have, several parties to a conflict within the same context, or what is also very likely to be to have a cross-border dimensions. So therefore, when you apply sort of a national approach to transitional justice, it is disconnected, right? It doesn't align with the complexity of conflict, right? So you have so this is why I think it was so appropriate, and so interesting that this idea of regional approach to transitional justice came about in the Balkans, because after the disintegration of the former federation and after the war, you ended up with a situation where victims were in one place, one country, the evidence was in another country, right? And the perpetrators have fled to a third country. So if a national approach was however successful it might have been, it would have sort of missed out on those regional kind of dimensions. And then, to be fair, this is also now recognized, for example, in the case of domestic trials, right, where there's some arrangements, right, for cross-border regional cooperation, sharing of evidence, extraditions, etc., etc.
I think that that makes RECOM even more so a fascinating sort of, not a paradox, but I don't know how to name it, that it was also community-led, coming from an NGO sector, and succeeded in what it was doing. Thank you. And my last question, unfortunately, we're limited by time. I would spend much more talking about the book, but my last question is more future-looking. I was wondering, what do you think can be the implications of your book when it comes to the practice of transitional justice, or when it comes to the academic scholarship, or maybe relevant interventions, some local initiatives? How does it inform all these?
So in terms of sort of, how this research can inform practice, I would say there are a few ways, and I will not elaborate on this regional dimension, which is what I've just done, but I think that is very, very important to put out there, to just, whenever we look at conflicts and we look at them in a national sort of framework, to think, actually, are there any cross-border dimensions, and how those can be accounted for. I would say the second way that is really sort of relevant directly to practice is this idea of consultation. But what I would say, what my work shows, is that the importance of communication and bringing sort of the opposed sides together. There's a particular format that may be more conducive to positive benefits. I mean, this is obviously yet to be tested more widely. But what this research has shown is that I think it's not sort of just good to bring people together to say, for example, to share in a forum what happened to them. I mean, there is some, for example, sociological research that says that these type of fora, these type of dialogues actually cement ethnic identities and even sort of strengthen the sort of, boundaries, symbolic boundaries. And what my book shows is that what you need to do is bring people together, not just to discuss what was done to them, right, in the presence of the other side, but what could be done to remedy that. You see what I mean? To bring them in a forum that would be oriented towards a solution. And I think that's where people would focus on collaborating, sort of bringing those experiences that are important to express in a public forum, but take that sort of, as you said, sort of put it in the service of something that is forward-looking, right? How to get over those. And maybe the third way in which it is relevant for practice touches on to very contentious debates that we have in the literature, both on transitional justice and on peace building. And that is, what is the role of civil society to create these spaces for dialogue? And I do have some sort of pretty, I would say, extensive and deep sort of developed discussions on this in the book, because I find that civil society is almost under attack, especially in the critical literature, where we've sort of slipped into sort of discussing civil society in terms of like predatory actors, right, who are after the donors' funds and who are participating in these initiatives very instrumentally and for their own good, and sort of, a new kind of peace profiteer, right? So now scholars are looking at some sort of grassroots level as another sort of third level of politics, right? So not state, not civil society, but something else where, you can have authentic and exactly. And I do take issues with those, and I show, without a doubt, right? Some NGOs and some models of funding are not good. But in these contexts where, like in the Balkans, where elites are not genuinely interested in pursuing justice, right? Where they often manipulate the victims in their own narratives, right? It is the NGOs, civil society organizations, and activists who are, I would say, maybe the only force, right, societal force that is standing for the interests of the victims, right? So in a way, again, sort of I address sort of those debates and sort of raise the question before we say, oh, all civil society is bad, we have to really rethink it, because had it not been for civil society and for these people, the activists who work in a very difficult conditions, right, where they are ostracized as traitors, etc., etc., and yet they can create these spaces that can have some sort of, impact on people, and show that things can be done differently than, what elites say, that, reconciliation is not possible.
I'm very happy that we're ending with the compliments to the human will, that what it can achieve, and also that we should focus more on forward-looking and what good is to come rather than what bad has happened. Denisa, thank you so much. I'm so happy we did this finally, and I hope our viewers and listeners will enjoy this talk. And also I call everybody to have a look at Denisa's book, which is again open access. Also visit Denisa's profile to have a look at her research and follow her on socials. Denisa, thank you so much.
Thank you, Aziz.
I hope you enjoyed it too.
Yes,
and
very interesting
I'm
questions.
looking forward to our future cooperation.
Thank you, Aziz.